For 10 years, the youngest tech billionaire in America believed his first love had betrayed him. She vanished overnight, leaving behind rumors she'd chosen money over love. He turned heartbreak into ambition, poverty into power, and built a billion-dollar empire just to one day ask her why. But on a private flight home from Monaco, everything shattered. Two mixed-race twins with curly hair and piercing blue eyes stared at him from across the cabin, eyes that looked exactly like his. Then a flight attendant stepped forward, elegant, composed, dark-skinned. It was her, and she was holding the children he never knew existed. 10 years earlier, long before his name would appear on magazine covers and stock tickers, he was just another student walking across campus with worn-out sneakers and a backpack that carried more hope than certainty. He was white, brilliant in a quiet way, the kind of intelligence that didn't announce itself. He came from nothing impressive, no legacy, no connections, no safety net. What he did have was pride. Too much of it, sometimes. Pride that made him refuse help. Pride that made him believe effort could compensate for everything money could not. She noticed him first, not because he stood out, but because he didn't try to. She was everywhere and nowhere at once. Morning lectures with her hair pulled back neatly, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. Afternoon shifts at the cafe near campus, hands moving quickly, smile, practiced, but never fake. Evening library hours, where she sat across from him at long wooden tables, stacks of books beside her like silent companions. She was a woman of color in a place that pretended diversity was solved simply by allowing her to exist. People praised her grades with surprise, questioned her presence without words, and assumed her ambition must come with a hidden price. She worked harder than anyone he knew. Not to prove she belonged, she already knew she did, but because she had no margin for error. They began the way quiet things often do. A shared glance across the library when the lights flickered. A whispered joke during a late-night study session. Coffee offered when both of them were too tired to pretend they didn't need it. They didn't announce themselves to the world. There were no public displays, no social media traces. Their love unfolded in borrowed corners of campus life, protected by shadows and mutual caution. He never once treated her like she was less. That, more than anything, was what pulled her toward him, with him. She wasn't impressive for someone like you. She wasn't a question mark. She was simply herself, intelligent, stubborn, warm, and deeply afraid of losing what little stability she had built. With her, he felt seen without being measured. She didn't care that his clothes were cheap or that his future was still theoretical. She believed in him in a way that scared him, because belief created responsibility. They dreamed carefully, not of mansions or impossible success, but of small freedoms. A place where rent wasn't a monthly panic, jobs that didn't drain dignity, a life where love didn't feel like a risk. They talked about it in low voices over dollar menu dinners, sitting side by side in cramped booths, knees brushing, sharing fries because it felt intimate and because it made sense financially. The world around them never stopped reminding them they were different. A professor once assumed she was there on a diversity scholarship and congratulated her on overcoming. A classmate joked that he was brave for dating outside his race, as if love were an act of rebellion rather than instinct. Neither of them argued. They learned early that surviving quietly required less energy then correcting ignorance. But silence came with a cost. The night it happened, rain swallowed the campus. Not the romantic kind, this was heavy, relentless, soaking rain that blurred streetlights and emptied walkways. Power flickered in the dorms. She had stayed late at work, closing the cafe alone, counting tips with aching fingers. He waited outside under a broken awning, hair damp, jacket too thin for the cold, because he knew she would be tired, and because being there felt like the only thing he could offer. They walked back together without umbrellas, laughing at their own foolishness, shoes splashing through shallow puddles. By the time they reached his dorm room, they were soaked through, breathless, cold, and shaking not just from the weather. The room was small, bare, a desk, a bed, books stacked everywhere. Nothing about it promised comfort except the way he looked at her, like the world could shrink down to the space between them and still feel complete. They hesitated. Both of them knew what that hesitation meant. Both of them understood the invisible line they had been carefully avoiding. Crossing it would change things. It would make the future heavier, riskier, more complicated, especially for her. The world forgave white men for mistakes. It was far less generous to women who looked like her. She was the one who moved first, not out of recklessness, but trust. That night was not dramatic. There were no sweeping gestures or cinematic declarations. There was nervous laughter, trembling hands, whispered questions answered with nods instead of words. It was awkward and tender and intensely human. They took their time, as if both of them were trying to memorize the moment, knowing something about it was fragile. He held her like she might disappear if he didn't. She let herself believe, just for a few hours, that she was safe. After. They lay tangled together while rain drummed against the window. He traced patterns on her skin, talking softly about nothing and everything. She rested her head against his chest, listening to a heartbeat that felt steady, dependable. For once, the world was quiet. Neither of them knew it would be the last time things were simple. The days that followed were normal on the surface. Classes, work, study sessions. But something had shifted beneath everything. A gravity had formed. Subtle but undeniable. He was happier, lighter. She was more cautious, more watchful. She had learned long ago that joy could be temporary, and that fear often arrived unannounced. Then came the night that broke her. She was walking home alone after another late shift, taking the shortcut she'd used 100 times before. The street was poorly lit, nearly empty. It happened quickly, too quickly for screaming to feel useful. A hand, a threat. Words spoken close enough to steal breath. The world narrowed to terror and disbelief, to the sound of her own pulse roaring in her ears. When it was over, she didn't cry. She went home, showered until her skin burned, and stared at herself in the mirror without recognition. Fear wrapped around her thoughts, cold and absolute. He had threatened her, promised consequences if she spoke, promised to ruin everything she was trying to protect. She thought of him, the man she loved, poor but proud, still fighting for a future. She imagined his anger, his need to confront, to fight, to make things right in a world that rarely rewarded righteousness. She imagined him getting hurt, expelled, arrested, broken. She chose silence. Not because she was weak, but because she was terrified of losing the only good thing she had left. Within days, she made a decision that felt like self-erasure. She withdrew from classes without explanation, quit her job, packed her things in the middle of the night. She didn't leave a note, didn't send a message. She erased herself from his life because she believed disappearing was safer than staying. When he came looking for her, her room was empty. No goodbye, no answers, just absence. By morning, rumors began to spread. Someone said she'd dropped out. Someone else said she'd found a rich man. The story grew sharper with each retelling, until betrayal sounded more believable than fear. He refused to accept it. He searched, asked, waited. But she never came back. And as he stood in the rain-soaked courtyard, where they had once planned a future in fragments, he made a promise to himself that would change everything. He would become powerful enough that no one could ever make someone disappear from his life again. He didn't know then that she had left, carrying more than memories. He didn't know that the night they crossed that line had already rewritten both of their destinies. And she didn't know that leaving him would cost them 10 years they would never get back. Silence did not arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, filling the spaces where words should have lived. The night it happened, she did not scream. Not because she couldn't, but because her body understood before her mind did that sound would not save her. The street was almost empty, rainwater glistening faintly under broken lamps, the kind of place people forgot existed. She had walked it dozens of times without fear, believing routine was protection. That belief shattered the moment a shadow moved too close, the moment a voice spoke her name as if it had always owned it. The details blurred in her memory afterward. Hands, breath, pressure, a weight she couldn't push away. What remained sharp was the threat. Low, calm, certain. He told her no one would believe her, told her what would happen if she spoke. He knew where she studied, where she worked, how easily stories could be rewritten when told by the right mouth. When it was over, she stayed on the ground longer than necessary. Not because she was injured, but because standing felt like agreement with reality. Rain soaked into her clothes, cold and indifferent, somewhere far away. A car passed. Life continued. She walked home alone, inside her dorm room. She locked the door and slid down against it, breath shallow, hands shaking so badly she had to sit on them to make them stop. She didn't cry. Tears required permission, and she had no idea who she was allowed to be anymore. She showered until the water ran cold, scrubbing at skin that no longer felt like hers. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, she looked away, afraid that if she stared too long, she would disappear entirely. Her first instinct was to call him. The thought hit her like a reflex, sharp and immediate. He would come. She knew he would. He would believe her without hesitation, anger igniting faster than caution ever could. He would confront, demand, expose. He would risk everything: his education, his future, his fragile progress, because that was who he was. Proud, fierce, certain that justice mattered more than consequence. That certainty terrified her. She sat on her bed, phone in her hand, thumb hovering over his name, while fear spoke louder than love. She imagined him bruised, expelled, arrested, broken by a system that had never been designed to protect men like him when they stood beside women like her. She imagined the whispers turning into accusations, the blame shifting effortlessly onto her shoulders. She imagined the words they would use: risky, complicated, unclear. She put the phone down. The next morning, she went to class like nothing had happened, took notes, answered questions, smiled when spoken to. The performance felt surreal, as if she were watching herself from a distance. Every sound was too loud, every touch too close. She flinched when someone brushed past her in the hallway, and then hated herself for it. At work, she moved mechanically. Customers complained about coffee temperatures and wrong orders. She apologized automatically. Her body obeyed routine because routine didn't ask questions. At night, sleep refused to come. When it did, it brought fragments she couldn't control. She woke up shaking, sheets twisted, heart racing, mouth open but silent. She stopped eating without noticing. Food tasted like obligation. Hunger felt irrelevant. Days passed, then more. The fear didn't fade. It settled. She began to understand something she had never fully grasped before: how easily a woman like her could vanish without explanation. How quickly the world would adjust around the absence. She had always known the rules in theory. Now she felt them in her bones. He noticed she was different. He asked if she was tired, if work was too much, if something had happened. He touched her hand gently, concern written across his face, and the contact nearly broke her. She wanted to tell him everything. The words crowded her throat, heavy and desperate. But fear tightened its grip. She shook her head, said she was fine, said it was nothing. Lying to him hurt more than the silence ever could. But she convinced herself it was temporary. Just until she felt safer. Just until she figured out what to do. Just until the fear loosened enough to breathe around. That moment never came. Instead, the threats replayed themselves in her mind, growing louder each time she imagined speaking. She began to see danger everywhere. Footsteps behind her, unfamiliar faces. The idea of staying, of being visible, felt unbearable. She withdrew from her classes without explanation. The administrative office didn't ask many questions. They rarely did. A signature here, a form there, another name erased quietly from the system. Her professors assumed she couldn't keep up. Some nodded knowingly, as if this outcome had always been expected. She quit her job the same day, leaving her apron folded neatly behind the counter. Her manager didn't argue. She was replaceable. Everyone was. Packing her belongings felt like dismantling a life she had built piece by piece. Books went into boxes first, clothes next, photos last. When she reached the picture of her and him sitting on the library steps, laughing at something she could no longer remember, her hands froze. She pressed the photograph to her chest, breath catching, then slid it between pages of a notebook she would take with her. She didn't write him a letter. Words had power, and she was trying to make herself smaller, invisible, untouchable. Leaving in the middle of the night felt appropriate. Darkness had already taught her how easily things could be taken. She moved quietly through the hallway, avoiding creaking floorboards, carrying only what she could manage alone. Outside, the campus slept, unaware that something irrevocable was happening. She never looked back. By the time he realized she was gone, her absence had already begun to collect stories. Someone said she'd dropped out. Someone else added motive. By the end of the week, the rumor had transformed into something ugly and convenient. She had found a better offer. She had chosen money. She had never been serious. He didn't believe it. Not fully. He searched anyway. He checked her dorm, her workplace, the library. He waited outside lecture halls she would never enter again. Each unanswered question sharpened into something colder, heavier. Doubt crept in, not because he wanted it to, but because silence is persuasive when it stretches long enough. She was already gone by then, returning to a place she had sworn she would never go back to, carrying fear like a second skin. She told her family nothing, told herself she would endure. That survival was enough. What she didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that her body had already begun to change. That life, fragile and uninvited, was taking root in the quiet aftermath of everything she had lost. And what he didn't know was that the silence she left behind would become the driving force of his life. That the unanswered question of why would harden into ambition. That absence would turn into fuel. That night took more than her voice. It rewrote both of their futures, whether either of them was ready or not. Absence has a shape. It settles into familiar places and refuses to leave, rearranging the air until everything feels slightly wrong. He learned that in the days after she disappeared. At first, he assumed there had been a mistake, a missed message, a shift change he hadn't known about. He stood outside the cafe where she worked, watching strangers come and go, convinced she would appear if he waited long enough. When closing time passed and the lights went out without her silhouette behind the counter, unease crept in, thin and sharp. He went to her dorm the next morning. The door was locked. Her name was still on the small paper tag taped to the frame, slightly crooked the way she'd complained about once. He knocked anyway. Once. Twice. Then again. Louder. No answer. A passing student told him she hadn't been seen for days. Someone else said she'd moved out suddenly. No explanation. No forwarding address. The campus was good at swallowing people quietly. He told himself she'd call, that whatever had happened, she would explain. They had crossed a line together. They had shared something too real to abandon without a word. Trust. He believed. Meant endurance. By the third day, concern turned into urgency. He skipped lectures to search places she loved. The library desk where she always sat. The old steps behind the humanities building where they used to eat lunch. The bus stop she took after late shifts. Each location greeted him with indifference, as if her presence had never altered it at all. The world did not seem to notice she was gone. That hurt more than he expected. He asked questions carefully at first, then desperately. Friends shrugged. Classmates speculated. Someone mentioned she'd withdrawn from her courses. Another added, casually, that people like her rarely stayed long anyway. He didn't respond to that. Anger felt useless without direction. Then the rumors began to reach him fully formed, sharpened by repetition. She'd left with someone older, someone wealthy. She'd gotten tired of struggling. She'd always had ambitions beyond campus life. Each version painted her as calculating, opportunistic, quietly unfaithful. Each retelling chipped away at something inside him. Not because he believed it, but because he couldn't disprove it. Silence is persuasive when it stretches. He waited for a message that never came, checked his phone until the battery died, replayed their last conversations endlessly, searching for signs he might have missed. Had she seemed distant, tired, afraid? He remembered the way she'd smiled and dismissed his questions, the way her hand had trembled briefly in his. At the time, he'd assumed exhaustion. Now, doubt twisted memory into accusation. If she had trusted him, wouldn't she have said something? That thought lodged itself deep and refused to leave. Weeks passed. The semester moved on without her. Professors erased her name from attendance lists. Her seat in lecture halls filled with someone else. He watched this happen, powerless, and understood for the first time how easily a person could be rewritten out of existence. The world offered him explanations, whether he wanted them or not. It always preferred a simple story. He stopped defending her publicly, not because he believed the rumors, but because repeating her name without answers felt like bleeding in front of strangers, privately. He held on to a quieter version of hope that one day she would reappear and explain everything, that there was a reason he simply couldn't see yet. Hope, however, is a demanding thing. When it wasn't rewarded, it began to change shape. He poured himself into work with a focus that startled even his professors, studied harder, slept less, refused distractions. Pain sharpened his ambition, gave it edges. If love could disappear without explanation, then stability had to be built from something more reliable, something measurable, something no one could take without consequence. Money began to look less like greed and more like armor. He graduated with honors and no celebration, declined invitations, avoided campus events. The place held too many ghosts. He left without looking back, carrying only a conviction that poverty had made him vulnerable in ways he refused to experience again. Years passed, measured by progress rather than time. He failed often at first, ideas rejected, projects underfunded, nights spent staring at screens, convincing himself exhaustion was temporary. He learned quickly which rooms he was allowed in and which ones required him to prove he belonged. He learned how differently people listened when they thought you had something to offer. With each small success, he felt farther from the boy who had waited outside a cafe for a woman who never came. And yet, she never fully left him. Every achievement felt incomplete, lacking a witness who mattered. He imagined telling her when something went right, imagined her quiet smile, her careful pride, imagined the life they might have built if she had stayed. These thoughts no longer hurt sharply. They ached, low and constant, like an old injury. Sometimes, late at night, doubt returned with teeth. Maybe the rumors were true. Maybe she had chosen differently. Maybe love had never meant as much to her as it had to him. That possibility wounded his pride more than his heart. And pride does not heal easily. By the time his name began appearing in industry conversations, the story of her had settled into something unfinished, but distant. He didn't speak of her anymore. Not to friends, not to colleagues, not even to himself. He told himself that unanswered questions were simply part of growing up. He did not know that she was watching his rise from a distance she never closed. Back in her hometown, life moved slowly and heavily. She learned how to exist without being noticed, how to carry responsibility alone. Her days revolved around work, family obligations, and a growing awareness that her body was changing in ways she could no longer ignore. Fear returned. Not sudden, but relentless, layered with disbelief. When the truth became undeniable, She sat on the edge of her bed for hours, hands resting against her stomach, heart racing with questions she couldn't afford to ask. She counted weeks, replayed timelines. Denial collapsed under arithmetic. The child was his. The realization did not bring comfort. It brought panic sharpened by love she had never allowed herself to mourn. She thought of him instantly, his plans, his struggle, the future he was building with nothing but willpower. Telling him now felt impossible. He had moved forward. She had chosen silence. Dragging him back into her life with a truth this heavy felt like cruelty. So she stayed quiet. Months passed. Her body changed visibly. Whispers followed her through familiar streets. Judgments came easily in places where women like her were expected to endure without explanation. She endured. When the time came, she gave birth alone, holding pain in her teeth, refusing to scream. The nurse looked at the twins with surprise. One boy, one girl, small and fierce, already clinging to life with determination. She stared at their faces through tears she finally allowed herself, and felt something inside her shift irrevocably. Love, she realized, did not require permission. 10 years passed like this, on parallel tracks that never crossed, each of them shaped by the same silence in different ways. He built an empire. She built a family out of resolve and sacrifice. Neither of them knew how close they were to collision. But absence has a memory. And one day, when the world least expected it, that memory would demand to be acknowledged. Motherhood did not arrive like a miracle. It arrived like a reckoning. She learned this in fragments, in the small, brutal lessons that followed the twins' birth. Sleep came in minutes, not hours. Fear became practical. Love became relentless. There was no room left for grief, the way she had once known it: sharp, indulgent, consuming. What replaced it was quieter and heavier, a responsibility that demanded she stand upright no matter how tired her bones felt. The boy cried louder. The girl watched more. She noticed these things early, cataloged them instinctively, as if understanding their differences would somehow help her protect them better. They were small, impossibly small, curled against her chest with a trust she had not earned yet, but would spend her life honoring. Their skin carried her warmth. Their hair curled softly like questions she wasn't ready to answer. And their eyes, still newborn dark, would one day become impossible to ignore. She did not name him, not out loud. At the hospital, forms were filled in neatly. The space for father left blank, without comment. The nurse hesitated for only a second before moving on. No one asked questions she couldn't answer. No one offered explanations she didn't want. Silence, she had learned, was an efficient shield. When she brought the twins home, the house felt smaller, heavier with expectation. Her family loved the children without conditions, but their love came braided with concern, with whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the room, with looks that asked questions she pretended not to see. They never pressed her for details. That mercy cost them something too. Days blurred into routines, feedings, work, rocking chairs worn smooth by repetition. She took whatever jobs she could manage, without drawing attention. Nothing that required ambition, nothing that risked exposure. She learned how to stretch money until it barely resembled itself. She learned how to smile while exhausted, how to laugh softly when her children laughed, how to make a home feel safe even when the world outside did not. At night, when the twins slept, She allowed herself to think. That was when he returned to her, not as he was now, wherever now had taken him, but as he had been. The boy who studied too late and worried too much. The man who had held her like she mattered in a world that rarely told her so. She imagined him reading to the children, imagined his surprise, his tenderness, the way his pride would soften around them. Then she imagined the cost. He would be dragged into a life he hadn't chosen, judged, measured, bound to a past she had deliberately buried. Worse, he might feel obligated rather than joyful. She could not bear that possibility. Love, she believed, had to be freely chosen, or it turned poisonous. So she stayed silent. Years passed, not gently but steadily. The twins grew into themselves. The boy asked questions that began with why and never seemed satisfied. The girl observed before she spoke, choosing words with care that felt far older than her age. Strangers commented on their eyes, on the unusual brightness of them, on the way they seemed to catch light differently. She smiled politely and changed the subject. At school, assumptions formed quickly. Teachers praised her dedication with surprise that mirrored old familiar patterns. Other parents asked careful questions. She learned how to redirect conversations gracefully, how to remain warm without revealing too much. She refused pity. She did not ask for forgiveness. The world, as always, offered judgment more easily than understanding. Meanwhile, far away, his name began to mean something. She learned about it accidentally, the way life-altering information often arrives through a headline glimpsed in passing, through a television murmuring in the background while she folded laundry. A young entrepreneur breaking barriers, a tech innovator disrupting industries. The camera captured a man sharper than memory, confident where he had once been cautious. Her breath caught. For a long moment, she couldn't move. The room felt suddenly too small, too intimate with her thoughts. Pride rose first, swift and undeniable. He had done it. He had become what he'd promised himself he would be. Relief followed. Then something more dangerous, longing sharpened by distance. She turned the television off. From that day on, she avoided his name deliberately, told herself it was safer not to know, that the life he was building had no room for the one she had chosen. The children needed stability, not nostalgia. She needed resolve, not dreams. Still, she noticed patterns. The twins' curiosity mirrored his. Their stubbornness echoed hers. Sometimes, when they laughed together, something in her chest tightened painfully. A recognition she did not allow to surface. She wondered if the universe found irony amusing, creating reflections she refused to acknowledge. She became careful in ways she hadn't been before, chose paths that minimized risk, said no to opportunities that felt too visible. The idea of crossing worlds, his and hers, felt dangerous. She had spent too long surviving quietly to invite chaos now. Then came the job offer that changed everything. The airline position promised stability, benefits, and anonymity wrapped in professionalism. The uniform created distance, authority, a role that allowed her to exist without explanation. The twins were old enough to understand routines, young enough to adapt. She accepted with a mixture of fear and resolve. Flying taught her a new kind of control. In the air, gravity loosened its grip, and she felt briefly untethered from the weight of history. Passengers came and went, stories intersecting for hours before dissolving. No one asked where she came from. No one demanded justification. She did not expect fate to be so precise. On the day everything shifted, she boarded the aircraft with the calm professionalism she had perfected. The flight was private, exclusive, the kind of assignment that required discretion above all else. She reviewed the passenger list without recognition, names reduced to logistics. She did not look at him immediately, not until the twins, now older, more curious, restless in the unfamiliar luxury, began whispering questions she gently hushed. When she glanced up to reassure them, her gaze collided with a face she had tried to forget for a decade. Time did not stop. It folded. Recognition struck him first. She saw it in the way his expression faltered. In the split second where control slipped, she felt it echo through her body like a shockwave. The uniform, the distance, the years, they dissolved instantly. What remained was raw and undeniable. Then he looked at the children. She followed his gaze helplessly, dread blooming slow and certain. She saw the moment it registered, the instinctive calculation, the disbelief giving way to something far more dangerous. His eyes traced familiar lines he had never known existed. Her hands trembled. She stilled them. There would be no scene, no confession here. At 30,000 feet, she finished the service with mechanical precision, heart racing beneath a composed exterior. When she passed him again, their eyes met briefly. No words. Too many truths crowded the space between them. By the time the plane landed, the life she had built in silence had begun to crack. She did not know what he would do, what he would ask, how much power he now carried. She only knew that absence had finally failed them. And once silence breaks, it does not return quietly. Power did not announce itself with noise. It arrived the way pressure does quietly, invisibly, until the structure of everything around him began to change. By the time his name was spoken with reverence instead of curiosity, he had already learned how to carry control without displaying it. Meetings ended when he stood. Rooms adjusted their temperature to his presence. People listened differently now, weighing each word they offered him as if it might cost them something later. He had become what he once believed would protect him untouchable. And yet, standing on that aircraft, staring at the life he had never known existed, he felt more exposed than he had in a decade. He did not speak to her during the remainder of the flight, not because he didn't want to, but because instinct told him that some truths needed space before they could breathe. He watched instead quietly, relentlessly. The way she corrected the children gently when they fidgeted, the way she positioned herself between them and strangers without thinking, the practiced calm of a woman who had learned to contain storms. The children fascinated him. They were not mirrors, exactly, but echoes. The boy's curiosity carried his intensity, sharp and impatient. The girl's gaze held something deeper, observant, deliberate, like she measured the world before offering herself to it. When they laughed together, something ancient and unfamiliar tightened in his chest. Recognition moved through him, not as logic, but instinct. Biology did not ask permission. By the time the plane touched down, he was certain of only one thing: silence was no longer an option. He waited until the cabin cleared, until protocol allowed him a moment that could not be mistaken for coincidence. When she turned, their eyes met again fully this time. The years between them collapsed under the weight of shared history. She looked older, stronger, carved by responsibility in ways that made him ache. He wondered, briefly, how much of that strength had been earned alone. "Please," he said quietly. Just a minute. She hesitated. The uniform held her upright, professional to the last thread, but her hands betrayed her, fingers curling inward as if bracing for impact. The children stood close, instinctively aware that something significant was happening, even if they didn't yet understand it. We shouldn't, she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not. I know, he replied. But we need to. That word need hung between them, heavy with implication. They did not argue. There was no drama, no raised voices. The moment demanded restraint, not performance. She nodded once, barely perceptible, and guided the children ahead with a soft instruction. When they were out of earshot, the space left behind felt dangerously intimate. You disappeared, he said. Not accusation, not pleading, just fact. She inhaled slowly. I survived. The answer struck harder than any explanation could have. It told him everything and nothing all at once. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, wanted to reach for her, to anchor himself in something real. Instead, he did what power had taught him to do. He waited. Let silence work. Let truth decide when to surface. I didn't come looking for you, she continued. Not then, not now. I did, he said. Every day. She looked at him then, really looked, and something in her expression softened before closing again. Vulnerability flickered and vanished. You found something else. Yes, he said, but not what I lost. The words were reckless, honest. He had learned that honesty, when offered sparingly, carried weight. They parted without resolution, without promises, without closure. But the fracture between past and present had opened, and neither of them could pretend otherwise. That night, alone in his hotel suite, he stared at the city lights without seeing them. His mind replayed details with merciless clarity. The children's faces, their eyes, the timeline. Mathematics replaced denial. He ran numbers the way he always did. Cold, precise, unforgiving. The probability was undeniable. He ordered the investigation himself, quietly, legally, no dramatics, no shortcuts. He did not want suspicion. He wanted certainty, within days. The results arrived, sealed and clinical, stripped of emotion. He read them once, then again, then set the file down carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter something. The children were his. The realization did not feel triumphant. It felt devastating. 10 years. 10 years of absence he could never reclaim. 10 years of choices made without him. He thought of her nights alone, of decisions weighted by fear and love in equal measure. He thought of the rumors he had almost believed, the doubt he had allowed to fester. Guilt settled into him slowly, thorough and unrelenting. Power. He learned in that moment. Did not protect against regret. He requested a meeting. This time, she did not refuse. They sat across from each other, in a quiet space, chosen for neutrality. No luxury, no intimidation. Just two people navigating the aftermath of a shared past. She listened as he spoke, really listened. Arms folded, not defensively, but protectively. I won't take them from you, he said before she could voice the fear he saw building behind her eyes. I would never do that. Her breath released slightly, a fracture in her composure. You don't get to decide that alone. I know, he said. That's why I'm asking. The words surprised them both. He explained what he knew, what he had confirmed. He did not accuse her of deception. He did not demand answers. He told her, simply, that he wanted to be present, that he would respect boundaries, that he would not expose them to a world that would consume them without consent. She stared at the table for a long time before speaking. I left because staying felt like destruction, she said. Not because I stopped loving you. The admission was quiet, but it cracked something open between them. He did not press further. Some truths needed time to unfold. He had waited 10 years. He could wait longer. But this time, he would not do it in ignorance. When he finally met the children, properly introduced, not as a stranger, not as a benefactor, but simply as someone who cared, the connection was immediate and unsettling. They studied him with the unfiltered curiosity of youth, unburdened by the weight of context. He answered their questions honestly, but gently. He did not claim what had not yet been offered. Afterward, alone again, he understood something fundamental. The empire he had built was not the point. It had never been. Power had given him reach, influence, protection, but love demanded something far more dangerous: presence, vulnerability, the willingness to be changed. For the first time in years, his ambition shifted direction, not toward expansion, toward repair. He had always believed control came from distance, from observing without being seen, deciding without being questioned. It was how he'd survived his rise, by keeping emotion contained, by refusing to let the past dictate the present. But now the past had a face, 2 of them, actually, and distance no longer worked. He did not rush. That surprised even him. In the weeks that followed, he resisted the instinct to assert, to fix, to claim. Power had taught him that urgency often disguised fear, and fear made terrible decisions. Instead, he moved carefully, reshaping his life in ways that did not feel like intrusion. He adjusted schedules, declined travel, created space where presence could grow organically rather than be imposed. She noticed, not immediately, but in small ways. He showed up when he said he would, left when asked, never pushed, never assumed. The man she remembered proud, impulsive, burning with certainty, had softened into someone quieter, more deliberate. That transformation unsettled her more than arrogance ever could have. The children adapted quickly. They accepted him with the uncomplicated logic of youth. He was interesting. He listened. He answered questions without talking down to them. He did not buy their affection, though he easily could have. Instead, he read with them, walked with them, learned the rhythm of their lives without trying to rewrite it. She watched all of this from a careful distance. Trust, for her, was no longer instinctive. It was something constructed slowly, deliberately, after weighing consequences. She allowed him access because denying it felt dishonest to the children and to herself. But she kept her guard intact, reinforced by years of survival that had taught her how quickly safety could dissolve. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep, she found him standing by the window, city lights reflecting faintly against the glass. He did not turn when she entered. He sensed her presence and waited. They don't know, she said quietly. I know, he replied. I haven't told them who you are. He nodded. That's your decision. She studied him then, searching for hidden pressure. There was none, just patience, steady and unassuming. It unsettled her. She had prepared herself to defend boundaries, not to negotiate shared ones. You could take this to court, she said. You have the means. I could. He agreed. But I won't. Why? He turned finally, meeting her gaze without defensiveness. Because love isn't leverage, and because they deserve truth that isn't weaponized. The words lodged somewhere deep in her chest. She did not respond immediately. Silence, she had learned, could still be useful, but this time it was not armor. It was consideration. That night, after he left, she lay awake long after exhaustion should have claimed her. Memories surfaced uninvited. The way he used to listen, the way he used to look at her, as if the world made more sense with her in it. She had believed that version of him had been lost to ambition. Seeing this man now complicated everything she thought she understood. She had not expected him to change. She had expected him to demand. In his own space, he confronted a different kind of reckoning. For years, he had measured success in metrics and milestones, growth curves, market dominance, valuation. None of it prepared him for the vulnerability of watching his children exist in a world he had not protected them from. He felt awe and grief in equal measure, pride in who they were becoming, sorrow for the moments he had missed. He also felt anger, not at her, at the version of himself who had believed that becoming powerful would somehow retroactively fix what had been broken. Power could open doors. Yes, it could correct injustices, sometimes. But it could not rewrite time. It could not soften the weight of a decade lost. That anger needed direction. He began looking backward with intent. At first, the information surfaced slowly. Record, reports, names buried in old databases, overlooked because no one with influence had bothered to dig. He did not tell her what he was doing. Not yet. He understood now that some truths needed to be offered carefully, not extracted. What he uncovered disturbed him not because it was unexpected, but because it was familiar. The system had worked exactly as designed. The threat had never needed to be explicit. Silence had done the work. Fear had finished the rest. He closed the file and sat back. Breath measured. Control firmly in place. Justice, he decided, would not be loud. It would be precise. Meanwhile, she struggled with a quieter conflict. The children had begun asking questions not directly, but with the gentle curiosity that signaled awareness forming. Why did he come around so often? Why did he look at them like that? Why did he feel familiar? She answered what she could without lying. She spoke of friendship, of history, of care. She avoided labels because labels made things real, and reality demanded decisions she was not ready to make. One afternoon, as she watched him help the boy with homework, while the girl leaned against his side reading, something shifted irreversibly. It was not jealousy. It was not fear. It was grief, clean and sudden for the family that could have existed without trauma, without silence, without absence. She stepped away before the emotion could betray her. Later, when they stood together in the quiet aftermath of another shared evening, She spoke without looking at him. "You don't owe us this." "I know," he said. "Then why stay?" He considered the question carefully. "Because obligation feels heavy. This doesn't." She turned, surprised despite herself. His expression was open, unguarded. No strategy, no performance, just truth offered without expectation. "I loved you," he continued. "I never stopped. I just didn't know where to place it." Her breath caught. Love, she had learned, was dangerous when spoken carelessly. But silence had cost them everything, once already. She did not promise him anything. She did not confess what still lived in her chest. But she did not retreat either. That was enough for now. The night ended without resolution. But something fundamental had changed. The past had begun to loosen its grip. Not because it had been erased, but because it was finally being faced. Neither of them knew how difficult the next steps would be. But for the first time in 10 years, they were no longer walking in opposite directions. They were standing in the same room, learning slowly, carefully how to move forward together. The past does not stay silent when it senses weakness. It waits, patient and precise, for the moment when the walls around it soften enough to crack. He felt that moment approaching. It began subtly, not with confrontation, but with a shift in how the world responded to him when she was nearby. When they walked together in public spaces, glances lingered longer than politeness required. Whispers followed with a familiarity that suggested recognition rather than curiosity. A woman like her beside a man like him still unsettled people. Even now, especially now. Power did not erase prejudice. It merely changed how carefully it was expressed. She noticed, too. Years of reading rooms had taught her how to detect judgment before it spoke. She straightened instinctively when eyes lingered too long, adjusted her tone when conversations cooled unexpectedly. The children, unaware of subtext, moved through it freely, laughing, questioning, unafraid. Watching them, she felt both pride and dread. Innocence was precious. The world was efficient at breaking it. One afternoon, the tension finally surfaced. They were leaving a quiet cafe, the children ahead of them, when a voice too casual, too sharp cut through the air. A man commented on how unexpected the family looked together. He smiled while saying it, as if that softened the implication, as if curiosity absolved intrusion. He responded before she could. His voice remained calm, measured, but something unmistakable hardened beneath it. The man apologized quickly, suddenly aware of the imbalance he had misjudged. Power corrected the moment efficiently, too efficiently. She felt the familiar chill settle in afterward. "That's what I wanted to avoid," she said once they were alone. What he asked, though he already knew. "This," she replied, being seen as something that needs explaining. He absorbed that quietly. "I can't control how people see us." "No," she said, "but you can control how visible we become." The words were not accusation. They were boundary. He nodded. "Then tell me where the line is." She hesitated. That was the problem. She didn't know anymore. That night, after the children were asleep, she finally spoke the truth she had been skirting for weeks. Not the event itself. She still could not name it aloud, but the fear that had followed her for a decade. I left because I was afraid. She said, not of you, of everything else. He did not interrupt. I knew if I stayed, I would be questioned, dissected, disbelieved. I knew the narrative would never be in my control, and I couldn't survive that again. He repeated softly. Her hands clenched together. The word had slipped out before she could stop it. For a moment, she considered retreating, sealing the truth back inside where it had lived for so long. But retreat had cost them 10 years. She could not do that again. There was someone. She said finally. That night I stopped answering your calls. Something happened. He did not move. I was threatened. She continued. I was made to believe that speaking would destroy everything. You, my future, my family. I didn't know how to protect us all. So I chose silence. The room felt impossibly still. His reaction did not come in the form she expected. There was no explosion, no demand for details, no visible fury. His face changed slowly, as if a new understanding was settling into place, rearranging everything beneath it. How long have you carried this? He asked. Her voice trembled, despite her control. Every day. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with intention. You should have never had to. Guilt flooded him, sharp and immediate. Not because he blamed himself for what had been done to her, but because he had lived 10 years, believing her silence was choice rather than survival. Because he had allowed doubt to take root where trust should have stood. I thought you left because you stopped loving me, he admitted. She laughed once, softly, without humor. I left because loving you felt like the most dangerous thing I could do. That was when his restraint finally fractured. Not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally. Something ancient and protective surged into motion. The instinct that had once driven him to promise he would never be powerless again sharpened into focus. Do you want justice? He asked quietly. She looked at him, searching his face. I want peace. I know, he said. But sometimes peace comes after accountability. Her chest tightened. Fear rose reflexively. I don't want revenge. Neither do I. He replied. I want truth. On your terms. He did not push further that night. He had learned that trust, once broken by the world, had to be rebuilt gently. But the path ahead had clarified itself. In the days that followed, his movements became more deliberate. What he uncovered confirmed what he had already suspected. The man who had hurt her had not disappeared. He had thrived in the shadows of systems that rewarded silence and punished vulnerability. Complaints had been filed and quietly dismissed. Patterns had been noted and ignored. The truth had always been there. It had simply never been protected. He did not involve her. Not yet. Justice, he believed, should never re-traumatize the person it claimed to serve. Meanwhile, the children began to ask harder questions. Why does he look like us? The boy asked one evening, blunt and unafraid. She froze. Before she could answer, the girl spoke instead. He feels like family. Children, she realized, did not need explanations the way adults did. They recognized connection without language. She looked at him then, really looked, and something shifted inside her. The man before her was not the boy she had loved, nor the distant figure she had watched rise from afar. He was something else now, someone capable of holding truth without destroying it. That frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. One night later, after the children were asleep and the city hummed quietly beyond the windows, she found herself standing closer to him than she had intended. The air between them felt charged, familiar in a way that stirred memories she had tried not to revisit. "I don't know what this makes us," she said. He did not reach for her. He did not rush the moment. "It makes us honest," he replied. For the first time, her breath hitched. Honesty had once felt like a luxury she could not afford. Now it felt like a door heavy, intimidating, but real. Outside, the world remained complicated, unforgiving, steeped in judgment and imbalance. But inside that quiet space, something fragile and necessary began to take shape. Not forgiveness, not resolution, but the possibility that the truth, once spoken, could finally stop haunting them and start guiding them instead. He did not tell her when the search truly began. Some protections are invisible by design. He understood that better than most. For years, power had been a language he spoke fluently: contracts, influence, systems that bent quietly when pressed in the right places. But this time, he approached it differently. Not as a man who wanted control, but as someone who understood that control, when used without care, could become another form of harm. He started with distance. Records were requested through channels that would not carry his name. Old reports surfaced slowly, layered in bureaucratic dust. A pattern emerged. Not dramatic, but unmistakable: complaints redirected, testimonies minimized, consequences postponed indefinitely. The man had learned early that the world rarely punished those who moved carefully enough. It made his jaw tighten, not because of rage. Rage was loud and imprecise, but because of the elegance of injustice. How smoothly it hid itself. How many women had likely been told, as she had, that silence was safer. He built a team without ever calling it one. People who understood discretion, people who believed truth mattered, even when it was inconvenient. He insisted on legality, on process. Nothing would be rushed. Nothing would be forced. The goal was not spectacle. It was accountability that could not be undone. At home, life continued in its delicate, in-between state. The children sensed the gravity of change without understanding its cause. They grew more curious, more observant. The boy began asking questions that edged closer to truth. The girl watched adults' faces and stored conclusions quietly, as if preparing for a future where knowing mattered. She noticed his distraction. He was still present, still gentle, but his thoughts traveled elsewhere at times. Eyes darkened by focus, she recognized from her own periods of survival. One evening, after the children were asleep, she asked him directly, "What are you carrying alone?" He did not deflect. That surprised her. "I'm making sure no one can ever threaten you again," he said. Her breath stilled. Fear rose instinctively, sharp and familiar. "I didn't ask you to do that." "I know," he replied. "That's why I didn't tell you." Silence settled between them, not hostile but heavy. "I don't want you to lose yourself for this," she said quietly. "I've already lost too much." He stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "I won't," and I won't move unless you tell me to stop." She studied his face, searching for dominance, for ego. She found none, only resolve shaped by restraint. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar stir relief without surrender. Weeks passed, pieces aligned, when the case finally moved forward. It did so without warning. No public statements, no media leaks. Just formal charges delivered with precision. Evidence compiled patiently over years was suddenly impossible to ignore. The system that had once protected the man now found itself unable to shield him from its own rules. She received the call on an ordinary afternoon. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, unremarkable. It explained options, rights, next steps. She listened without interruption, fingers pressed flat against the table as if grounding herself. When the call ended, she did not move for a long time. He found her that way. She did not look up when he entered the room. "It's happening," she said. "Yes, I'm afraid," she admitted. Saying it aloud felt like a release and a risk all at once. He knelt in front of her, then not symbolically, not dramatically, but simply to meet her eyes at the level where fear lived. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to. Not now. Not ever." Her chest tightened. For so long, fear had been something she managed alone, something she swallowed to remain functional. Hearing it acknowledged without pressure felt disorienting. "What if it breaks me open again?" she asked. "Then I'll be here," he said. "And if it doesn't, I'll still be here." The proceedings moved quietly, deliberately. She chose what to share and what to protect. No one rushed her. No one demanded performance. When she spoke, it was measured, controlled, rooted in truth rather than spectacle. Each word reclaimed a piece of ground she had lost. The verdict came without fanfare. Guilty. The sentence followed, heavy enough to matter, final enough to stand. The man was led away without drama, without the attention he had once thrived on. Justice did not raise its voice. It simply closed the door. Afterward, she stood outside the building, sunlight falling strangely soft against concrete. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from the release of a weight she had carried for a decade without naming. She expected relief to feel louder. Instead, it felt like quiet. That night, she slept without waking from dreams she could not remember. The children sensed the shift immediately. The boy hugged her without explanation. The girl watched her carefully, then smiled in a way that suggested understanding beyond years. He did not celebrate. He stayed close, attentive, offering steadiness without insistence. Power, he had learned, was most meaningful when it stepped back after doing its work. In the days that followed, something else began to change. She laughed more easily, spoke with less hesitation. Her posture softened, no longer braced for impact. Trust did not rush in. It approached cautiously, testing ground, but it was no longer unthinkable. One evening, as they stood together watching the city settle into night, she spoke without preamble. "I don't feel haunted anymore." He turned toward her slowly. "What do you feel?" She considered the question, present. He smiled then, not with triumph, but with gratitude. The past had not been erased. It had been faced, and in that facing, something fundamental had shifted between them. Love, once bound by fear and silence, had learned how to breathe again. Not fully, not yet. But for the first time, the future felt like something they could approach without flinching. Healing did not announce itself with certainty. It arrived like morning light, gradual, tentative, illuminating some corners while leaving others in shadow. She felt it in the way her breath no longer caught when the phone rang, in the way her body stopped bracing before footsteps behind her. Peace, she learned, was not an ending. It was a practice, the world. However, noticed the shift immediately. Photographs surfaced first. Nothing scandalous, just proximity. A powerful man, seen often with a woman who did not fit the narrative people preferred for him. The children appeared next, always partially obscured. Their presence more rumor than confirmation. Speculation followed, as it always did, threaded with familiar prejudice disguised as curiosity. He watched the reaction with a calm, sharpened by experience. For years, public perception had been something he managed strategically, a variable to be controlled. Now it pressed against something more personal, something he refused to reduce to optics. She felt the pressure differently. Every glance carried implication. Every comment arrived weighted with expectation. She had survived invisibility. Visibility was a different kind of trial. She worried for the children most. Worried that association with him would invite scrutiny they had not chosen. Worried that her past would be dissected and distorted until it no longer resembled truth. One evening, she voiced that fear aloud. "I don't want them growing up feeling like they have to justify their existence," she said quietly, "or ours." He listened, as he had learned to do, without interrupting, without defending himself prematurely. "Then we don't justify," he replied. "We live, publicly if necessary, honestly always." "That sounds idealistic." "It is," he admitted. "But ideals are what survive pressure." She studied him, searching for arrogance. She found none. The man before her understood consequences. He simply refused to let them dictate his values. That distinction mattered more than she expected. The decision, when it came, was not dramatic. They did not announce anything. They did not hide either. He introduced the children to his world slowly, deliberately, ensuring every environment they entered was prepared to protect rather than consume them. He corrected assumptions without spectacle, redirected conversations without apology. When questioned directly, he answered simply, without embellishment or defensiveness. "This is my family," he said once, in a room full of people, accustomed to control. The statement landed with quiet finality. She felt something settle inside her then. Not relief, recognition. The children adapted with the resilience that had always defined them. They learned new routines, new faces, new expectations. They asked questions when they needed to, accepted answers when they were ready. Their bond with him deepened, not through grand gestures, but consistency. He showed up. He stayed. He listened. One afternoon, as they sat together in a park, far from cameras and schedules, the boy asked the question she had been anticipating for months. "Are you our dad?" She froze. He did not. He knelt to their level, eyes steady, voice gentle. Yes, he said. If you want me to be. The girl tilted her head, considering. We already wanted you, she replied simply. Something in her chest broke open then, not painfully, but completely. She looked away, tears blurring the edges of a moment she had never allowed herself to imagine. That night, after the children slept, she stood at the window again, city lights stretching endlessly beyond reach. He joined her without speaking, their shoulders brushing lightly. The contact felt natural now, no longer charged with hesitation. I'm scared, she admitted, not of losing you, of trusting happiness. He smiled softly. Happiness isn't something you trust. It's something you choose, over and over. She turned to face him. The years between them had carved lines and wisdom, but the essence remained, the quiet intensity, the steadiness she had once loved without fully understanding. She reached for his hand first, this time. I choose, she said. The word felt like a promise. The world did not grow kinder overnight. There were articles, opinions, thinly veiled judgments, wrapped in commentary about suitability and image. Some investors expressed concern. Some acquaintances withdrew politely. He absorbed it all with measured calm, drawing boundaries where necessary, applying pressure where appropriate. Power, he knew, could be used to protect as effectively as it could to dominate. He chose protection. When asked in an interview about the unexpected direction of his personal life, he did not deflect. The most meaningful things rarely look planned, he said. They look true. She watched the interview later, alone, heart steady. He had not spoken for her. He had not hidden her. He had simply stood beside truth and let it exist. That mattered. Their relationship deepened quietly, without urgency. They relearned each other, not as students, grasping for stability, but as adults, shaped by consequence. They talked about fears openly now, about boundaries, about what rebuilding meant when the foundation had once collapsed. Some nights, memory crept close, threatening to reopen old wounds. Other nights, laughter replaced it, light and unexpected. Love, she discovered, did not erase trauma. It coexisted with it, offering gentleness without denial. One evening, he took her somewhere small and unremarkable, a place without security or spectacle. Just a table by a window, warm light, and time that felt unclaimed. Halfway through dinner, he reached into his pocket and paused. She noticed immediately. Don't, she said softly. Not like this. He smiled, understanding. He placed the small box back where it had been and reached for her hand instead. Then not yet. Trust was a language they were still learning. As the year drew toward its close, the rhythm of their life settled into something resembling balance. The children thrived. She found herself imagining futures without flinching. He learned to rest without guilt. One night, lying beside him, listening to the city breathe beyond the windows, she realized something quietly astonishing. She was no longer afraid of being seen. The truth had survived scrutiny. Love had survived time. And the family they were becoming, imperfect, resilient. Real felt like something worth defending openly. She turned toward him in the darkness. Whatever comes next, she said, We face it together. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. Reverent and sure. Together. He agreed. Outside, the world continued to judge, to speculate, to simplify. Inside, they chose something far more difficult. They chose each other. The wedding was not an announcement. It was a conclusion. Not the kind that closed a story neatly, but the kind that gathered every loose thread and acknowledged where it had been before deciding where it would go next. They chose privacy deliberately, not out of fear, but intention. A place far from spectacle, where silence felt earned rather than imposed. The guests were few. The air was warm. The light moved slowly, as if even time understood it had been invited to witness something delicate. She stood at the edge of the day, wearing simplicity, like armor and grace, like truth. No excess, no performance, just a woman who had survived, learned, chosen. When she walked toward him, the children leading the way, the world narrowed into something astonishingly quiet. He watched her with a steadiness that had taken years to build. This was not the man who once promised himself power at any cost. This was someone who had learned that love demanded presence more than protection, humility more than certainty. He reached for her hands, grounding himself in the fact that she was real, here, choosing him without coercion or fear. Their vows were brief, not because there was little to say, but because they had already spoken most of it through action. He promised honesty without spectacle. She promised truth without retreat. Together, they promised the children consistency, safety, and a home where questions were welcomed rather than feared. When the officiant declared them married, there was no gasp, no dramatic pause, just a soft collective breath, released. Afterward, the children ran ahead, laughter cutting through the quiet like proof. She watched them go, heart full in a way that still surprised her. For so long, happiness had felt like something temporary, something she borrowed with caution. Now it felt anchored. Later, when the guests had left and the evening settled into intimacy, she stood beside him, watching the horizon darken. He wrapped an arm around her, familiar and new all at once. "Do you regret how long it took us to get here?" he asked. She considered the question carefully. "I regret the pain," she said, "not the becoming." He nodded. That distinction mattered. Life after the wedding did not transform into ease overnight. There were still negotiations, still boundaries to reinforce, still eyes that lingered too long. But something fundamental had shifted. They no longer faced the world as parallel survivors. They moved as a unit, deliberate and unafraid. The children flourished in ways that felt almost defiant. The boy grew bolder, curiosity expanding into confidence. The girl learned when to speak and when to observe. Her insight deepening into wisdom that startled adults. They were not sheltered from truth, but protected by it. A year passed quietly. The announcement of her pregnancy did not arrive with drama. Only certainty. Twins again. The symmetry felt almost humorous, as if life had decided to echo itself deliberately this time. Without cruelty, she laughed when she told him. Disbelief and wonder tangled together. He stared at her for a long moment, then pressed his forehead to hers. Breath unsteady. "We're ready," he said. It was not bravado. It was recognition. The months that followed were slower, softer. He learned patience in a new way, attending appointments, memorizing routines, measuring time in anticipation rather than urgency. She allowed herself rest without guilt, trusting that support did not equal weakness. When the babies arrived, another boy and girl, small and fierce, the world contracted again into something manageable. 4 children, 1 home, a future that no longer felt theoretical. She watched him hold the newborns, expression reverent and undone. This, she realized, was what healing looked like, not erasing what had hurt, but building something strong enough to carry it without breaking. On quiet evenings, after the house had settled into sleep, they talked about the years they had lost, not with bitterness, but honesty. They named what had been taken without allowing it to define them. The past remained present, but it no longer dictated their direction. One night, standing together by the window as they had so many times before, she rested her head against his shoulder and spoke softly. We didn't get the life we planned. He kissed her hair, gentle and sure. We got the life we chose. Outside, the city continued to turn, indifferent and vast. Inside, their home breathed with the rhythm of something resilient and real. Power had once promised him protection. Love had taught him accountability. Together, they had built something quieter, stronger, and infinitely more dangerous to the narratives that had once tried to define them. They did not defeat the world. They outgrew it, and in doing so, they found not the ending they once imagined, but one far more honest, rooted in truth, bound by choice, and alive with the sound of 4 children who would never have to learn silence the way their parents once had.